I think most of us share a common belief in Jiu-Jitsu that to get better, we just need to show up, roll hard, and keep doing this. And if we run into a plateau, we should probably just go harder. We chase the feeling of being completely wiped out because we think it's the only marker of a productive session. But what if there was a smarter way to train? What if there was an objective marker to tell us how hard you're working and how well you're recovering? If we only keep trying to go harder, we eventually run into a trap. Inevitably, we will hit a wall. Maybe you're feeling chronically fatigued, or those overly athletic blue belts just have your number. The default response that I typically see leans one of two ways. Either we double down and push ourselves deeper into the hole, or we take time off and our progress backslides. Neither truly addresses the root cause and lead us into a cycle where genuine, sustainable progress is difficult to achieve. This is compounded by how hard it is to objectively assess Jiu-Jitsu progress. Our technical skills are very hard to gauge because our training partners are also getting better. And our strength and conditioning is very difficult to objectively measure whether it's transferring to improved performance on the mats. It turns out you might be wearing part of the solution on your wrist. In this video, we'll explore how something as simple as heart rate and its more nuanced cousin, heart rate variability, can help to solve these problems. These can act as your body's dashboard, providing objective information that your subjective feelings might have missed. I'll also share some of the common pitfalls I see grapplers fall into when trying to use this data. Think of your body as a finely tuned car, or in my case, a beat-up old Honda Civic. Your heart rate and heart rate variability are just a couple of measures that should be sitting on this dashboard. They help to provide real-time feedback into how hard we're working and can also give us a gauge of how well we're recovering. When you're constantly going hard, even if you don't feel burnt out, your dashboard might be throwing up warning signs. The main reason we're interested in heart rate is twofold. First, it tells us how hard you're working at that moment. And second, it gives us a clue at how your nervous system is handling that stress. As we exercise, the working muscles demand more oxygen, which necessitates an increase in blood flow. Your heart responds either by pumping more blood or increasing the amount that it pumps. That is, it increases the rate of contraction all the way up into your maximum heart rate. Secondly, your heart rate is intricately controlled by the nervous system. At rest, the parasympathetic nervous system puts the brakes on the heart rate, slowing it down. Now, as we exercise, those brakes get pulled off as the sympathetic nervous system speeds up the heart rate. This is related to a concept called heart rate variability, which is a measure of how much variance we have between beats. Generally, a higher heart rate variability is an indication of better cardiovascular fitness. However, we'll see that this is a bit more nuanced. The biggest pitfall I see grapplers making, and I made myself, is thinking that more data is better. Collecting more data without understanding what it means or why we're using it just leads to more overwhelm. This increases the noise and hides the signal we're looking for. We need to understand what each of those gauges on the dashboard is trying to tell us. As I said before, heart rate increases with exercise intensity. Now we can classify this intensity of work in various different ways. Typically, we'll express this as a percentage of our maximum heart rate. Steven Seiler, who's an absolute OG in the endurance world, developed the 5-zone model. Zone 1 would represent any heart rate between 55 and 72% of your maximum. Zone 2 would be 72 to 82%. Zone 3 would be 82 to 87. Zone 4 would be 87 to 92. And finally, Zone 5 would be anything above that. The main idea here is that the higher of a zone we are training in, potentially the more fatigue that we're generating. Now, there are a couple of big problems using this zone model in grappling. First, the zones are actually determined off what's called our lactate threshold. These are set points where the blood lactate accumulation begins to change. Now, I don't know about you, but most of us aren't measuring blood lactate on the mats. So getting an accurate understanding of what zone we're actually working in is quite difficult. The next issue is the way the heart responds to grappling. Those zones are really based off endurance exercise. So think about things like running, swimming, rowing, and cycling. And we need a few minutes to actually observe what the heart rate does. This constant work allows the heart rate to ramp up and eventually achieve a steady state given the intensity is at a sufficient range. Now in grappling, this doesn't happen. Brief, explosive actions during a roll mean that we never achieve steady state, and instead our heart rate goes up and down throughout the round. Secondly, our heart rate is affected by the type of muscular contraction. In something like cycling, the rhythmic contractions of the muscles actually help to pump blood back to the heart. In grappling, this very clearly doesn't happen. There are a lot of isometric or constant contractions, which means that the heart has to work even harder as the blood pressure increases. This means that heart rate might not be the most effective measure of how hard we're working. Now, heart rate variability seems to be pretty useless during exercise for most sports. According to this paper by Martin Boucher, it may be useful for endurance athletes who are working below their first ventilatory threshold. This is kind of like the lactate threshold, but above this, it doesn't really tell us that much. The same is true for resistance training. We really don't have enough data yet to say how meaningfully it can tell us how hard that session was. The final thing to consider is that heart rate is just one measure of stress. It really doesn't tell us how hard the rest of the system is working. For sports like grappling, the neuromuscular system is being hammered, and there's a massive contribution from the anaerobic system. And we can't quantify these from heart rate alone. The second way that heart rate can be used is to monitor recovery and adaptation. In general, as we get fitter, we'll see our resting heart rate decrease and measures of heart rate variability increase. During exercise, we'll see that our heart rate decreases for the same overall work rate. Unfortunately, in grappling, it's not that simple. Our resting heart rate does change over time. However, there's quite a bit of variability day to day. Heart rate variability is even more sensitive to the time of day, as well as the position we take the measurement in. Additionally, if we find that our heart rate decreases during a roll, this may not mean we're getting fitter. We could just be going easier, or we could be getting better, or our partners just could be having a really off day. Likewise, if we measure heart rate variability at a different time of the day, so say after our coffee versus before, we can get a completely different measurement. Now let's make things even more complicated. The context of our overall training is pretty important too. For example, in this study, a measure of heart rate variability actually decreased and got worse, even though athletes' performance was improving. The root mean sum of square differences is a measure of heart rate variability that's kind of consistently used. This initially crept up once the initial training period. However, it began to decrease as the athletes tapered into competition. Now, this doesn't mean that heart rate variability is useless. We just need to understand the greater context we're taking it in. The last mistake I see with heart rate monitoring is using it to solely tell you how recovered you are and whether you should train. I've heard athletes say that they aren't recovered just because their phones told them they aren't. Because daily fluctuations exist, we need to take this consistently over a long duration before we can start informing our training off of that. So if we are measuring this consistently, first thing in the morning, and we notice, say, an increase in greater than 10 beats per minute, this could be an indication that something is off. Heart rate variability is very similar. If we notice a decrease in a measure like that root mean sum of square differences I spoke about, we notice this is below our established average, that may be an indication of under recovery. However, while this data feels scientific, blindly following it can mean that we jump to more of the noise rather than the signal. Many of the available wearable devices, like Garmin or Whoop, use a black box approach to calculate our recovery and our training readiness. This means that we might not know the measures or the algorithms they're using to determine that. In these situations, we actually need to learn to lean on the subjective rather than the objective. We want to balance an objective measure like heart rate or heart rate variability with a subjective measure like your mood, your motivation, or your desire to train. This can be far more effective than blindly listening to your device. And if we add something simple in, like a jump test, we've got a hell of a monitoring system. I've highlighted some of the challenges with measuring your heart rate and heart rate variability, but that doesn't mean it's useless. Far from it, actually. When used correctly, it's an incredibly powerful tool. Here are my recommendations for leveraging heart rate and heart rate variability to monitor your training. First, if we're collecting resting heart rate or heart rate variability, we want to do so first thing in the morning for at least 3 to 4 days per week. This is usually easiest first thing upon waking. Now, heart rate variability follows these same guidelines. However, informing your recovery in Jiu-Jitsu is a little bit less useful. With both of these measures, we want to collect data over a long period of time to be able to find an average. When we record these alongside details of our training, things like volume, intensity, and type, we can get a sense of how we're responding. If our heart rate starts to drift up in response to training, we may need to review what we're doing. On the other hand, if our HRV begins to drift down, we should probably check in. However, don't make your decisions based off these alone. If you feel good to train, you should do so. As you collect more data and be able to integrate this with how you're feeling and how your perceived recovery is, you're going to be able to make much better decisions. Next up, if you want to monitor how your fitness is improving, you can set up a standardized test once a week. What I would recommend is that you jump on a bike for 5 minutes as your warm-up. You want to keep the power output the same each time. For example, say 100 watts. Now record your heart rate in the last minute of that each time. We'll be able to see how that progresses over time. For example, as we get fitter, we should see our heart rate drop at that same 100 watts. Because we're keeping the workload the same, a decrease in our heart rate is pretty indicative of an improved aerobic fitness. For a bonus, track how many beats it drops in 60 seconds after you finish exercise. This is called heart rate recovery, and it may be a better indication of fitness. Finally, and critically, learn to listen to your body. The challenge with trying to monitor your heart rate during a roll is it's so individual and so dynamic. Your heart rate may not perfectly match up with your perceived exertion. The good news, you don't even need a heart rate to monitor how hard your roll is. We can use what's called the talk test, which is completely free and pretty well correlated with internal load. It's simple. If you can speak in full sentences, you're probably somewhere around zone 2. As it becomes harder to talk, you're probably creeping into higher zones. So yes, This is your evidence-based excuse to shit talk your partners while you're rolling with them. Here's the crucial point. Knowing these numbers is important, but knowing how to interpret them and when to pay attention is key. Not everyone needs this level of detail though. The ultimate goal with any data we collect is to generate knowledge that will allow us to make better decisions about our training and our recovery. By learning how to understand your body's dashboard and heart rate variability, we move beyond just climbing out of the hole of gassing out or frustrating plateaus. You're becoming an informed practitioner. You're moving away from guessing your way through your training to being able to intelligently integrate objective and subjective data. So next time you step on the mat, remember your body has a lot to tell you. You've just got to read the dashboard.